Good morning, everybody. I'm still Bamshavi Samson, the e-tutor for this 206 human-computer interaction. We are in section 3 of the course, unit 1, design guidelines, rules, and principles. The human-computer interactions introduction still similar to what we have in section 1 and section 2. Then the learning outcome of this unit 1 section 3 is by the end of this particular class, students were expected to be able to select design guidelines, to be able to know how to monitor guidelines and carry out prototype tests. The students should be able to understand the concept of translating selected guidelines into design rules. They should be able to also explain various types of design rules. It is expected that students should be able to learn some design principles, to know how to use design rules, to know how important of documenting design rules. So those are the things that is expected from the student at the end of this class to have been able to at least have an understanding of. Then introduction. Design guidelines, rules and principles. This particular unit offers guidelines for design of user interface software in 6 functional areas. Number 1, data entry, data display, sequence control, user guidance, data transmission, and data protection. And the guidelines are proposed here as a potential tool for designer of the user interface software. Guidelines can also help establish rules for coordinating individual design contribution, can also help to manage design decisions just once rather than leaving them to be made over and over again by individual designers. It can also help to define detailed design requirements and to evaluate user interface software in comparison with those requirements. The design of the user interface software will often involve a considerable investment of time and effort. Design guidelines can help ensure the value of the investment. Guidelines are more subjective and general. There are 2 types of guidelines. They are, number 1, abstract guidelines for all principles that are applicable during early design life cycle activities. Number 2, detailed guidelines, otherwise called style guides, that are applicable during later system lifecycle activities. Then understanding the justification for guideline aids in resolving conflicts. Selection of design guidelines. Not all the guidelines can be applied in design any particular system. For any particular system application, some of the guidelines will be relevant and some will not. Design guidelines must be generally worded so that they might apply to many different system applications. Thus, generally worded guidelines must be translated into specific design rules before they can actually be applied. What they are simply saying is that there are some guidelines that will not be applicable to all the system. Some will be, some will not. So in that format, so guidelines were supposed to be generally worded so that at least the majority of the system can actually make use of majority of the system application can actually make use of it. The process of selecting relevant guidelines for applications and translating them into specific design rule is referred to here as tailoring. That is the process of what? The process of choosing relevant guidelines for applications and translate those guidelines into specific design rules is called tailoring. Who will do this guidelines tailoring? It should be the joint responsibility of the system analyst and human factor specialist assessing design requirements of software designer assessing feasibility and of their own manager. That is, the human requirement and system analyst, both of them should be responsible for this tailoring. It may also be helpful to include representative of the intended system users. That is, it also makes sense to also include those people who are going to use the system, maybe their own system administrator or their own their own system administrator should be part of the team that are carrying out this tailoring. Not only system analysts, not only specialists in human factor requirement. So the team of the system user should be part of the team that will carry out those tailoring, so that at least they will have an understanding of their own requirement. They will have their own input at the develop stage of that software. Once all relevant guidelines have been identified, it may also be helpful to include yes of the intended system user to ensure that proposed design feature will meet operational requirements. Yes, once all relevant guidelines have been identified, a designer must review them and decide which one actually apply, so that you will not just model up everything. You will not go and use all the guidelines that will include the relevant and irrelevant guidelines. So once all those guidelines have been identified, it must be reviewed so that it will tailor it down to the required one. There are two reasons why a designer might not wish to apply all guidelines. First, for any given application, some guidelines may conflict. Yes, they may conflict, and the designer must therefore choose which are more important. Second, budgetary and time restrictions may force the designer to apply only the important guidelines, those that promise to have the greatest effect on the usability. Yes, so that you will be able to man budgetary, and at the same time you will be able to avoid conflicted guidelines. Expertise experience versus guidelines. Guidelines cannot take the place of expertise experience. An experienced designer or one skilled in the arts might do well without any guidelines. An inexperienced designer might do poorly even with guidelines. So few designers will find time to read an entire book of guidelines. If they do, they will find it difficult to digest and remember all of the materials. If guidelines and or the rules derived from the guidelines are to be helpful, they must be kept continually available for ready references. Guidelines cannot take the place of expert designer consultants, or at least not entirely. A design expert will know more about a specific topic than can be presented in the guidelines. An expert will know what questions to ask, as well as many of the answers. An expert will know how to adapt generally stated guidelines to the specific need of a particular system design application. An expert will also know how to trade off the competing demand of different guidelines in terms of operational requirements. What they are simply saying in that area is that guideline can't replace experts. It can't replace experience, because experience is is accumulated of learning process over the years that has been acquired by an expert designer, because many steps has been accumulated and stored in his own brain hard disk, that every time he can recall all those process without having to consult any design guidelines or any books. But before one become an expert, such person too has undergo several processes whereby he has also learned through the curve over the year of time, over the continuous consultation of those designer guidelines. But as you design a system repeatedly, you master the process to the point that you might not even need to consult any books or any guidelines, and you can easily identify the conflicting guideline in the process of designing. So that is why they said experts positions cannot be replaced by a designer guideline. But for a fresh designer, need continuous reference of those design guidelines in order to master and accustom himself to the steps required to build a new software applications. So in that aspect, so expert cannot be replaced by a guideline. So that is the position of the understanding of this course. So monitoring, guideline, and prototype testing. For maximum effectiveness, guideline tailoring must take place early in the design process before any actual design of user interface software. In order to tailor guideline, designer must have a thorough understanding of the task requirement and user characteristics. Thus, task analysis is a necessary prerequisite of guideline tailoring. The result of guideline application will be a design for user interface software that may incorporate many good recommendations. However, even the most careful design will require testing with actual user in order to confirm value of good features and discover what bad features may have been overlooked. Thus, prototype testing must follow initial design, follow in turn by possible redesign, and operational testing. Indeed, testing is so essential for ensuring good design that some experts advocate early creation of an operational prototype to evaluate interface design concept interactively with user, with iterate design changes to discover what works best. But prototyping is no substitute for careful design. Prototyping will allow rapid change in proposed interface. However, unless the initial design is responsible, good prototyping may not produce a usable final design. What they are simply saying here is that at the early stage, it is expected of design for a design team to carry out early tailoring. Guideline tailoring is required by system analysts, then human human expert human expert, and also representative of the system users. Those who are going to use that system has to be part of the early tailoring uh, activities, so that you can trade off the bad guideline from the beginning, so that it will not be as if when the system is completed, that is when you now started revisiting those tailoring activities. So that continual testing of those, subjecting the system to testing. That's why they say prototype will also help. Prototyping will help people to be able to know which feature is important, which feature is less important, and which feature has been ignored, and which bad features that are not supposed to be part of the system that has been also included, that need to be faced off. So even continuous prototyping might not even produce the final good design, but it will help to guide the designer towards a very essential user interface for software application. So, translation of the selected guideline into design rules. Because guidelines are intended for use on a variety of systems, they are worded in general terms. Before a guideline can actually be applied, it must be translated into specific design rules. For instance, a guideline which states that display should be consistently formatted might be translated into a design rule that specify where various display features should appear, such as the display title, prompts, and other user guidelines, errors, messages, command entries, etc. Any guideline can have different possible translations. A guideline which states that each display should be unique identified will be translated into a design rule that display title will be bolded and centered in the top line of the display. Or it could be translated into a design rule that display title will be capitalized in upper level corner of the display. What they are trying to say is that there should be a general term when creating a design guideline, so that at every point in time that display is being presented to the user, it should be generally acceptable worded language for every designer. That is what they are trying to say in this concept. So, some of the design rules, type of design rules that we have: rule based on principles. This comprises of abstract design rules, rules based on low authority, and those based on high generality. That is, there are rules based authority that at least it must be adhered to when presenting the rules or when making a design of an application. The rule based of standard. There are specific design rules from high authority but with limited applications. Rule derived from guidelines. These are rules of a lower authority but of more general application. Documentation, implementation, and evaluation of design rules. After design rules have been specified for each selected guidelines, those rules should be documented for reference by software designer and others involved in system development. Documentation of agreed rules, subject to periodic review and revision as necessary, will help coordinate design process. Documented rules can then be applied consistently for a given application. with appropriate modification. Rules adopted for one application might later be used for other applications. In the course of design, it may be determined that a particular design rule cannot be used. Therefore, some means must be provided to deal with exceptions. If a design rule is not appropriate for one particular display, then an exception can be made by whoever has been appointed to make such decision. But if a design rule cannot be implemented at all, perhaps due to other design constraints, then all designer for that particular system must be notified, and perhaps another designer rule must be substituted. What they are trying to say in the documentation, implementation, and evaluation process is that for every design guidelines that eventually it will become a rule must be documented for reference, so that every other player that is involved in the design of that application can make reference to that rule, and such rule can also be applicable when designing another system. And when such rule is not, and where such rule cannot be applied, the room for exception should be applied, and all other designer or developer that is involved in that in development of that system should be notified. That is simply why all those design guidelines that eventually become rule need to be documented for reference purposes when implementation takes place. Using design rules. Since design rules suggest how to increase usability, they may differ in generality. And authority. Therefore, there exist various standards that guarantee uniformity of application. Some of these existing standards are the standards set by national or international body to ensure compliance by a large community designer. These standards require sound underlying theory, particularly on the slow changing technology. Hardware standards. These are more common than software standards. They are of high authority and low level of details in ISO 9241 standard that define usability as the effectiveness, the efficiency, and the satisfaction with which user accomplish tasks. 1. Broad brush design rule. Useful checklist for good design. Better design using this than using not. Different collection, e.g. center heuristic, then Schneider 8 golden rules, and norms 7 principle. So there are golden rules and heuristic governing design. These are regarded as broad brush design rules that provide a useful checklist for golden design. A better design is achieved using this than using nothing. The different collection include the Nelson 10 heuristic rules, the Schneiderman 8 golden rules, and the norm 7 principle. The Schneiderman 8 golden design rules, these are the list. Strive for consistency, meaning that you should ensure that all worded languages used in your design should be what? There should be consistency. Meaning that if you use something here, it should use something across for that particular rules. If you are using the guidelines that has become a rules, if you are using something for display, you should continue to use something for all display. Because where you went ahead and used Prince instead of Samsung, or you went ahead and used Corridor instead of Samsung for display, there will be a lot of conflict in that process. Then enable frequent user to use shortcuts. That is, you should create shortcuts for users so that it will enhance and hasten their productivity. Offer informative feedback, meaning that for every expression in your application software, there should be a room for feedback. Design dialogue to yield closure. Offer error preventions and simple error handling. Then permit easy reversal of actions, meaning if there is an error or a mistake in the process of designing, there should be room for quick reversal to your earlier position so that you can make corrections and move forward. That is one of the process a designer should put in place while designing a good system. Support internal locus of control. That is, there should be a room for internal control system. In case of glitchy, bottleneck, and other process, there should be control locus opportunity for rebooting the system back to the original default position. Reduce short-term memory loading. Then design principle, the normal 7 design principle. I just read the Schneidman. 1. Use both knowledge in the world and knowledge in the earth. Meaning the knowledge available in the world and the knowledge you have at your own disposal. You use both to at least assist yourself in application design. Then simplify the structure of task. Meaning that you should always adhere, or you should always strive to ensure that yes, there is simplicity in the structure of your design. Make things visible, bridge the gulf of execution and evaluation. Then get the mapping right. Exploit the power of constraints, both natural and artificial. Then design for errors. Should create room whereby there's an error, there should be a correction. Then when all airspace standardized, that is, when all your approach frames follow the general applicable standard in the world, that will help you in your design principle or guidelines. Design principle formulated to support usability. The purpose of this principle is to allow the application to be usable across board, to be generally acceptable across board. Principle of learnability. This is the ease with which new user can begin effective interaction and achieve maximum performance, because every new system that is deployed, the user do not need to undergo a fresh training to be able to use such an application. For every software application, there should be an easy way to learn how to use such an application. The learning process should not be too difficult for a user or a user of that system. Then the principle of flexibility. These are the multiplicity of ways the user and system exchange information. Principle of robustness. That's another one. That is, the principle of flexibility is user and the system interactions. Then robustness, principle of robustness. This is the level of support provided the user in the determining success, achievement, and assessment of goal-directed behavior. Meaning that system there must be a support level for the user in the development of such system. Then the principle, let's break it down. The principle of learnability are broken down into 2 again. Predictability. This is determined effect of future action based on past interaction history
and its operational feasibility. Synthesizability. Second one, this is assessing the effect of past actions, its immediate and its eventually honesty. The third one is familiarity, meaning that synthesizability, this is assessing the effect of the past, what action that has been or what has transpired in the past, then what is happening presently, and eventual honesty. Then familiarity, which is the third one, this is how prior knowledge apply to new system and how easy one can guess its affordance. Then the fourth one is generalizability of that system. We are breaking down learnability. This is extending specific interaction knowledge to new situation. Then the fifth one is consistency. This concerns the likeness, input and output behavior arising from similar situation or task objective. Then let's go to the principle of flexibility. That one too is broken down. When we break down the principle of flexibility, dialogue initiative. This is the freedom from system-imposed constraint on input dialogue, and it compares the system against the user preemptiveness. Meaning the purpose of initiating dialogue initiative is for the system to predict what the user is trying to do and suggest those predictions, and the user decide from those dialogue either to close or to say yes or to say no, or to move forward or to go backward. So dialogue preempts the user thoughts and allow the user to make decisions. Or in a situation whereby the user mistakenly take an action, dialogue will help the user to retract such an action instead of mistakenly executing a wrong instruction. So multi-threading. This is also expressing the ability of the system to support user interaction for more than one task at a time. It also looks at the concurrent and interleaving multimodality. Then task migratability. This is also passing responsibility for task execution between user and system, meaning that can migrate tasks from the user to system in what? In multiple ways. Then substitutivity. This allows equivalent value of input and output to be substituted for each other. It compares representation, multiplicity, and equal opportunity, where the substitution is needed between the input and output. This particular design principle helps to take those decisions. Then customizability. This is the modifiability and adaptability of the user interface by user, or the modifiability and adaptability of the user interface by the system. Meaning that how the user modify and adapt to user interface, or how the system modify and adapt to user interface, either user or the system, either of them, how they adapt and modify those interfaces. These are the principles of flexibility that take care of that. Customizability. Principle of robustness are also made of, under principle of, there is a broken down of observability. Observability, this is the ability of the user to evaluate the internal system of the system from its perceivable representation. It considers the browsability, the defaults, the reachability, the persistence, and the operation feasibility. So when you are observing, when the system, look at it, they said the ability of the user, look at it now, user to be able to do what? To evaluate the internal state of the system. The user must be able to evaluate the internal state. It should be able to think that, hey, this is what the system is trying to do, or this is the result the system or operation or instruction that this system is trying to carry out. In the course of observing or evaluating the state of the system, the user should be able to perceive all those representations, and in the course of considering all those things, it should be able to consider browsability, the default state, the reachability, then the persistence and the operation visibility. Then under this robustness, recoverability. Recoverability, this is concerns the ability of the user, we are still referencing the user, to take corrective actions. Once an error has been recognized, it looks at the reachability, the forward and backward recovery, and the commensurate effort. Meaning the user will be able to do what? Concern itself when there is a corrective action that needs to be taken during an error. When an error is recognized, it look at the reachability, both the backward and forward recovery, and commensurate it. It will take action to do what? To complement the recoverability of that system. Then responsiveness, under this robustness principle, this is how the user perceives the rate of communication within the system and how stable is the response. Then task conformance. This explains the degree to which system service support all of the user tasks, the task completeness and its adequacy. Meaning for every task that the user is trying to execute from the system, he has to now rate how the system supports those tasks and how adequate it completes those tasks. So I'm very sure at the end of this you have been able to at least understand what we are trying to say in this section 3 unit 1 regarding the system guidelines. In conclusion, the goal of interaction design is to design for maximum usability. Design rules comprises the principles of usability, which look at general understanding of the design, the standard and guidelines, which sets the direction for design, and the design patterns that capture and reuse design knowledge. In designing computer-based information system, special attention must be given to software supporting the user interface. So in summary, guidelines are more subjective and general. There are two types of guidelines: abstract guidelines and detailed guidelines. Understanding justification for guidelines aids in resolving conflict. Before a guideline can be applied, it must be translated into specific design rules. Those rules should be what? Documented for reference by software designer and others involved in system development must be notified. There are golden rules and heuristic governing design. For maximum effectiveness, guidelines monitoring must take place early in the design process before any actual design of user interface software is implemented. The system analyst, the human specialist, and the user representative must address this concern before design eventually takes place. Guideline cannot take place of expert experience. I've said it in the course of my explanation that experts learn over the years and acquire their experience over the years, whereby it makes them to be more effective than reading voluminous guidelines. Guidelines are strictly or mainly for new designer compared to an expert experience. And new designer need this guideline to continuously referencing those guidelines in as much to avoid stumbling into errors and bottlenecks. There should be early creations of an operational prototype to evaluate interface design concept interactively with users. There are certain design principles of learnability, flexibility, and robustness that are formulated to support usability. For listening to this lecture, we have come to the end of today's lecture, section 3, unit 1. Thank you for your patience.